By 5:30 a.m., barely just over an hour after only one company and a platoon, or essentially one troop and a platoon from the 1st of the 98th Cav that had been further back in the line of the vehicles moving in to assault the mechanized infantry battalion of the PLA forces of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade of the PLA's 83rd Group Army that was in the area after having had materialized upon its CCP regime properties. And as transiting civilians moving to and fro throughout the city in great panic and haste had informed the American forces in the local area of the PLA activity near their property, as their forces had moved into a city park in the area just south of the Buffalo Bayou tributary that ran through the city, essentially a river. As the two different battalions, or Cav squadrons in other words, had moved through the area as they had kept in steady contact with the HHT, who maintained their last official logistical stores beneath a highway overpass, which is the only reason why the logistics themselves have been spared, whereas most of the other neighborhood where the rest of the HHT troops were inside specific buildings that had been leased for their use had been heavily hit by sea-fired cruise missiles and land-fired tactical ballistic missiles in the form of DF-11As fired from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, which was itself a Trojan unit having had materialized just to the east of Austin, where another massive battle was already still underway, much like that which was occurring in Houston and elsewhere in the south central invasion sector of the entire nationwide invasion. As the Tu-22M had carpet munitioned most of these forces out of existence, the remaining forces, the company and platoon, essentially troop and platoon, which was a heavy troop of the 1st of the 98th Cav, and a rifle platoon from one of its rifle troops or mechanized infantry companies within the 1st of the 98th Cav, again, having had been just out of the blast radius of the enormous spread of the dropped munitions pounding a nearly half-mile by several miles long area, as they had started their campaign of dropping munitions just over a mile away from this battlefield, which was a 1 by 1 mile battlefield, before ceasing their munitions dropping, before continuing their overflight of the battlefield, before hooking around and hitting other areas of the city with the remainder of the munitions aboard. However, as the trap that had been laid by the coalition was very well executed with a high degree of precision, the fact that a company and rifle platoon had survived the ordeal was essentially something that went wrong. However, it would essentially be no real major issue, as a large number of PLA battalions were moving into the area, including the battalion that was fought by these two battalion-sized elements of American forces, these two Cav squadrons, before they had been munitioned out of existence by the dropping of massive tonnage of ordnance on their location, using the Tu-22M in a tactical manner. As another mechanized infantry battalion had moved into the area, along with one into the William P. Hobby Airport, also combat engineers as well, and forces from the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade themselves, one SHORAD battalion of the Type 625Es, and also a support battalion establishing themselves in the soon-to-be mega fob, with yet one more battalion, an armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade, moving up I-45 before departing from the highway into the William P. Hobby Airport, who would play a major role in rolling up the remaining American forces in a battle that would erupt just outside of the airport premises within a 2 by 1 mile area, as it would be a battle of maneuver in the ruins of what had once been urban neighborhoods that were adjacent to a commercial/industrial area involving petrochemicals and different office structures and even hotels in the area for executives from oil industries that would frequent those locations, as well as even a line from the Metro line, the same one that ran adjacent to this battlefield before it also turned south, as there were different Metro lines spanning the city in certain locations. As one went right by the William P. Hobby Airport, there were numerous battalions now in the area, including the 3 battalions coming from the 113th Combined Arms Brigade, the 1 armored battalion coming from the 60th, and now 2 battalions also from the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade moving in to establish themselves, including the support battalion, which was the chief logistical elements of the entire Air Defense Brigade's forces in the local area. As by this point in time, some of the air defense troops with their small arms and even certain other weapons available to them had destroyed on the flanks 2 groupings of armed reactionary civilians as they moved in and cleared out their AO. As these armed civilians were generally no real problem to deal with, even for air defense and even artillery troops, which had backup training as infantry troops, which was standard in most militaries. They had rolled up the civilian resistance in their local areas, and now were about to engage another grouping of armed reactionary civilians materializing in the bombed out ruins of these neighborhoods and this portion of the city that were directly south, slightly south and east of the previous battle that had taken place by the Buffalo Bayou, where these forces had been carpet munitioned by the Tu-22M. As the PLA forces of the armor coming from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade consisted of the vaunted Type 96B main battle tanks with all of their incredible features that included laser and IR scrambling, and of course their ability to fire ATGMs, their highly advanced ballistic computers, and also fire control system, and also their combat data link, and the ability to launch from their vehicle these quadcopter reconnaissance drones, as each vehicle crew had access, they being accompanied by their armored infantry forces, which complemented them by providing mutual infantry and armor support to one another in battle as they went through in their tactical formations, along with many of their very powerful vehicles, such as the VN-20 IFV, which had the capabilities of almost a light tank in terms of its armor protection, as well as the additional applique NERA or ERA armor plating, and also covered 2 rails with ERA plating whereby they could fire their very potent and slightly well-ranged HJ-12E, a newer anti-tank missile. While not quite possessing the range of the very powerful and capable HJ-10 anti-tank missile, these still outranged the American TOW system by approximately a mile. As was the 100mm main gun and the 30mm autocannon connected almost to it, they possessed incredible firepower within just these 2 weapons, with also a turret-based coaxial weapon consisting of a 7.62 by 54mm machine gun. They too had laser and IR scrambling, making them incredibly difficult to target with tank ammunition in conjunction with certain types of anti-tank missile systems, and among others. They possessed as their standard APC the Type 89A, which served as a mobile fire support platform and carried the troops into battle, as did the VN-20 with its squad that it possessed inside, as each platoon was made up of 1 VN-20 and 4 Type 89As that could carry their troops into battle and deploy them when and wherever needed, and support them with their machine gun turret with the very powerful 12.7mm heavy machine gun, the W-85, as they could deploy their troops with their anti-tank capabilities in the HJ-08. They would prove a devastating foe to fight in battle, as the armored infantry and mechanized infantry forces were arranged in the same manner when it came to the companies that comprised those elements within each battalion. As it was a mechanized infantry battalion, it would be arranged with the VN-20 and 4 of the Type 89As per platoon, just the same as the armored infantry, with the only difference with combat engineers being that instead of a 4th Type 89A, they would possess the GCZ-112, a very capable armored engineering vehicle that could clear minefields, construct obstacles, as well as destruct obstacles with a great degree of proficiency. In the anti-tank companies, as each armored battalion in the PLA forces possessed one, they possessed the very brand new and highly advanced QN-506 with its wide array of different weapons and capabilities. It was a scourge not just against tanks, but also even against low-flying aerial targets, as its anti-tank primary weapon, the QN-502C missile, could double as a short-range air defense missile, as well as also hit bunkers, armored vehicles, and buildings just alike, as well as also their laser-guided 70mm rockets, which they had in each side, with the QN-502C missiles, of which they carried 4 each, as they also possessed a 30mm autocannon, 7.62 by 54mm coaxial weapon, the S-507 short-range and small loitering munitions as well, 6 grenade launchers. These weapons were utterly devastating against enemy forces. Of course, loitering munitions had been launched previously. However, in this particular battle that would erupt between the American armor with their heavy troop, along with a single platoon of their rifle company or troop that survived, as they had 2 rifle troops and 198 Cav, unlike 1st Squadron, which just had 2 heavy troops. The 1st and 98th Cav had 1 surviving rifle platoon with its Bradley and its M113 armor personnel carriers, which had relatively light armor and could fall prey to many types of systems, including even rocket-propelled grenades, of which the Chinese essentially had an unquantifiable number of, as they had produced the Type 69 RPG in such enormous quantities that almost all of their military and paramilitary forces had wide access to these, and these were handed out relatively liberally to the troops, as this gave them a devastating capability not just against lighter vehicles in terms of armor protection, soft-skin vehicles, but also even against troop concentrations, as they had an anti-personnel rocket that could be utilized just the same as their anti-armor rocket. As they also possessed the HJ-08, these two were highly devastating against tanks, IFVs, and, of course, the American APCs. In this particular battle, the American armored forces would be engaged by a wide array of weaponry, as there were elements of this mechanized infantry battalion moving into the area here by the airport, as well as also the armored battalion moving up I-45 and arriving into the area but from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade, with the combat engineers elsewhere spread out throughout the area, as again, elements of this mechanized infantry battalion and the armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade, the mechanized infantry battalion being from the 113th Combined Arms Brigade operating in the area. Some of their comprising companies would be involved in this particular battle of maneuver through the wreckage of the city that had been previously hit again by the Tu-22M, the same one that moved slightly north and dropped massive ordnance on the 2 squadrons, with barely any of their forces surviving, a company and a rifle platoon, essentially a troop and a rifle platoon, a heavy troop. Going to the map of the area, again, this is a relatively larger area, being the fact that it was a 2-mile by 1-mile area, with the mauve-colored and elevated on stilting the civilian passenger rail line that went through this part of the city, and had a station right here, with these being stairwells, and of course they had an elevator inside to bring people up and down to the platform where the train came by. This fencing has been totally shredded up and destroyed around this industrial area here, wherein there's a petrochemical plant and many office buildings within this particular area, and even hotels, as this yet here was another industrial site, with these being hotels primarily. with there being some commercial areas and businesses here as well, like restaurants and bars, this was a gas station that had been hit and caught fire as many weapons had been utilized on the area, as the Tu-22M had wreaked total havoc with its spread of munitions flying over this area, carpet munitioning this neighborhood, as well as also ground-based fires that had come into the area from the armored forces and, of course, the mechanized infantry, whose battalion had its own fire support company consisting of 130mm multiple launch rocket systems, the Type 63s, not to be confused with the Chinese Type 63 armor personnel carrier, which is older than the Type 89A and was built in numerous numbers. The Type 69 multiple launch rocket system, with its easy to reload, easy to move and tow into battle, easy to set up and fire multiple launch rockets, fired the 30mm rockets, which were relatively destructive and were somewhat accurate, as their spread was not usually too wild in terms of where the rockets actually landed, and could be ISR directed into large targets such as this industrial building where there's many armed reactionary civilians hiding within, approximately 30 in this building and approximately 12 in this building here. 15. As the mortars, 120mm, from the assault gun / mortars, the dual-purpose weapon, the PLL-05s, which the fire support company had one firing platoon of, in addition to the 2 rocket platoons, was also firing in support of not just their own mechanized infantry company from their battalion that happened to be in this area right here, but also firing in support of the armored forces, of which there's elements of 2 different tank companies in this particular area operating from the armored battalion, with the rest of their companies within the William P. Hobby Airport in terms of their 2 other armored or tank companies, and their armored infantry would be working together in both armored infantry companies with their combat elements, leaving their headquarters platoons behind them, which were their logistical and command elements, would be moving up to offer some mutual support to the armor, which would eventually forge ahead on its own, leaving them behind to utilize their ISR assets and hold the area behind the advance. Essentially, that would be their operational directive in this particular battle. While the mechanized infantry company from the mechanized infantry battalion that was in the area, many of their forces further off the map to the north and even behind them as they were just moving into the area, they would be operating also in support of the armor of the 60th Combined Arms Brigade's armored battalion in the area, which also had its anti-tank company and its comprising platoons relatively spread out as well, with one of their platoons, these being the QN506s, in this area here, one platoon. They had another platoon in this area here, and they had their last 2 platoons of 4 combat platoons in this area here, spread out amid the fencing of the William P. Hobby Airport, of which this is one of the runways here, and this is one of the taxiways that connect the runways. This is the headquarters platoon of the armored company that had spread itself out and was about to move up and roll up the American forces that had made their way into this area after approximately an hour and a half of trying to reorganize and regroup themselves after the Tu-22M had completely ravaged and destroyed the rest of their battalion or squadron in CAV terms, with armed reactionary civilians going into and out of manhole covers that had been open, again using the underground to their advantage. As the headquarters battalion of the 113th Combined Arms Brigade had indeed fired a volley of 48 CH-901A loitering munitions. Early on, the volley had been equipped with fragmentation warheads, which were to cause maximum shrapnel effect, but not the heat warheads. And though they would not be able to destroy the tanks and IFVs with these, they could destroy the lighter skinned vehicles, which they did in tandem with anti-tank missile fire and loitering munitions from the QN506s launching their S507 short-range loitering munitions, in addition to their anti-tank missiles or QN502Cs, as well as their laser-guided 70mm rockets and 30-millimeter autocannons and grenade launchers for close-in targets such as armed reactionary civilians or any troops they would encounter. However, they would sit back and use their ranged weapons to their maximum advantage as the tanks would maneuver forward with the armored infantry rolling up to hold down the area behind the advance of the tanks and also offer mutual support to their anti-tank company, which was also a part of their armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade. Meanwhile, as Russian jets were preparing to return to an RTB due to fuel considerations, as well as already having had fired all their S-25 air-to-ground rockets that they had been equipped with as a air-to-ground munition, as by this point they were still primarily armed with air-to-air missiles, they were about to return to base after this final combat air patrol that they were conducting by 5:30 a.m. As the bombers could linger a bit longer due to their enormous fuel capacity, they too would eventually do a return to base once they had all dropped all their munitions. And as the Su-27s would leave, and there were a few with the Kabini systems, there would be a temporary lift of the electronic jamming that had caused the redundant communications like radios to cease working properly. And this would somewhat aid the Americans, although not by much, as by this point they had already lost the vast majority of their forces in terms of their defending forces. And all that was left essentially was a mop-up operation throughout the entire city. And this just being one part of it, as 120-millimeter mortar strikes would come in and decimate armed reactionary civilians, as well as 130-millimeter rocket strikes doing the same, as this was a volley of 130-millimeter rockets coming from one of the firing platoons, while this was a volley coming from the other in conjunction with two 120-millimeter shells, mortars from the dual-purpose assault gun mortar systems firing in support of their mechanized infantry forces that were about to surge forward, at least with two platoons of this one company, with their headquarters platoon being surrounded by another combat platoon to add additional protection with the MRAPs, which had heavy machine guns and were relatively decently armored vehicles of the Tiger MRAPs of the headquarters forces to protect the Shangji logistical trucks, the armored recovery vehicle, the MV3 fueler, and their command elements of their company commander, their captain, as essentially they had to go through all of these buildings wherein groupings of different armed reactionary civilian elements were taking shelter, with some ending up coming out and being destroyed as a result, as these different squads that were supporting their vehicles and their vehicles sitting further back to support them as mobile fire support platforms were moving through and clearing out these industrial buildings and offices. As all of that was happening, the American forces themselves were not sitting idle. They too were moving all throughout the map, as they totally lacked any ISR capabilities, as they had lost all of that during the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes. They essentially had to rely on word-of-mouth communications, hand signals, and very primitive means of obtaining any type of actionable intel, even if it was very scant, as a result of transiting civilians telling them what they saw. That counted as their only means of ISR at this point, as they were in a very sorry state and now had to rely on the transiting refugees and non-combatants and combatant civilians alike for information as they moved to and fro throughout the city. As the William P. Hobby Airport was now fully occupied by the elements of the armored battalion from the 60th Combined Arms Brigade, as well as elements from the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade that moved in, the support battalion, to help establish with logistics the forward operating base, and a SHORAD Air Defense Artillery Battalion, the Type 625Es. The mechanized infantry forces that moved into the area with combat engineers were spreading out to assist in mopping up the area with the armored battalion, who had elements of its battalion already inside the airport to secure the premises by establishing a very strong perimeter defense, along with the mechanized infantry battalion here, who had some of their forces in the airport already as well, with others out around it in the vicinity conducting the battle, such as this single company of mechanized infantry, of which per battalion there were 6 mechanized infantry companies with 1 fire support company and their headquarters and support company, which was their logistical and command forces. as they moved under the civilian rail, which they tried to preserve because they eventually wanted to use it for themselves during later colonization operations within the city, they surrounded the buildings, moving up alongside of them as per SOP, everything ISR directed, and they surged forward. But even as they did in their rolling T formations with the men on the ends of the rolling T, there's 3 point men, one watching the middle and the other 2 on each side, looking up at higher floors on buildings, on taller buildings. They broke into these buildings and began to get in savage firefights inside with their vehicles and additional other mechanized infantry dismounted squads behind their vehicles, using them as a rolling shield, double column rolling shield formations, moved up along either side of the building, communicating with their combat data links, which each NCO of each squad carried a PDA version of one, which also acted as a transponder, with their also having their radio headset to communicate constantly with their other forces. They moved into the building to raid the building and got into a savage firefight between both squads with the armed reactionary civilians that were inside of it. As their vehicles moved forward, this vehicle with its troops behind it would actually end up being lost, and armored recovery would be required to move up and remove the vehicle wreckage, as well as the combat medics following behind to essentially remove the wounded men as the result of the vehicle being destroyed, this being a Type 89A armor personnel carrier. Despite the fact that it had very strong frontal armor, it could not survive a tank shell coming from a high-velocity 120 millimeter Abrams main gun, essentially, as the Abrams tanks of the surviving armored troop were conducting their own maneuvers with this tank in this parking lot of these former commercial buildings adjacent to these industrial sites in this local area here, were essentially moving in and preparing to conduct a maneuver type of battle as they rolled up to the corner of the building, partially using it as a means by which to roll back and forth and fire. They would fire a shell that would destroy this Type 89A and essentially maim horribly some of the troops that were following behind it in their double column rolling shield, requiring the medics to move up with the armored recovery vehicle to recover the vehicle and the troops that were horribly injured that were directly behind the vehicle, whereas the troops that were a bit further back were in a bit better shape. But for the most part, the vehicle and its squad were essentially taken out of action, as the entire squad would have to be evacuated, medevac in the headquarters vehicles, as the headquarters forces had established their POW and their casualty collection point, of course, as that was something that the headquarters did in addition to logistical support, including even armored recovery when it came to their lost vehicles, as well as their combat medics that were in each and every headquarters element that would move in to treat and remove the troops if needed for first aid purposes, combat medics. As they moved by this gate building here, their other troops were already inside in a heavy battle, which this battle overall would last for some time, approximately an hour and a half, as methodically the armored forces engaging one another, the Type 96Bs with their very powerful 125 millimeter main guns, which had a relatively good range of over 3 miles, and with the ATGMs a bit further that they could fire from their breech, from their bores, they would maneuver in with these arrows moving up being the armored infantry forces. These were each a platoon from the 2 armored infantry companies moving up, again, to basically provide infantry support, not just to the anti-tank company elements of the different anti-tank platoons, the combat platoons that were sitting back using their ranged weapons, but also to cover the area behind the advance of the armor, because that was very important, because there were areas where armed reactionary civilians could pop up and potentially use a Molotov or anything like this to essentially try to cripple any of the PLA vehicles or ambush their forces, hence the need tactically for armored infantry support moving in behind the advance of the different armored forces. As at the opening of the map, there had already been many KIAs in the area as armed reactionary civilians took cover in rubble and were immediately KIA'd by the laser-guided rockets fired by the QN-506, as well as its 30-millimeter autocannon, which was utterly devastating, and the armored infantry moving up as well and wiping them out, their vehicles and troops moving up together, as all these arrows indicate the troops and vehicles combined, as the troops would have been dismounted and moving into the area to secure it in standard tactical formations, whether double column rolling shield or even if they were moving up in a line formation beside their vehicles to basically ensure that the vehicles were protected on either side. Essentially, what could happen is you could have the armored infantry on either side of a vehicle, or they could be in double column rolling shield behind each vehicle, including their own, such as their VN-20s and their Type 89As, or they could move in a line formation parallel to their vehicle. As this is an example of a line formation, although there's no vehicle shown, they could do that alongside of their vehicle, where they could watch different sectors of fire with the point man watching ahead and staggered weapons watching different ways, giving the entire troops in the squad 360-degree security, as there were a variety of different tactical formations which offered such and would be utilized as the PLA troops had a very high degree of organization, proficiency, and professionalism and discipline in terms of using their tactical formations, whereas the armed reactionary civilians at this point were not yet organized. They were not coherent as a fighting force because they did not use any type of real communications or any way to obtain any viable intelligence that could be used as actionable intel, as they had to basically do everything on the fly wherever they happened to be, as they were not yet organized. They had no leadership. Everything was on an individual basis or very small groups of people that just happened to bunch up together, and most of them would end up being KIA'd as they lacked much of the weaponry required to take on armored phalanxes of different armored vehicles with different capabilities. We're talking about tanks. We're talking about QN-506s. We're talking about the rolling machine gun nest or fire support platform of the Type 89A with a very powerful, the 12.7 millimeter W85 heavy machine guns. We're talking about the VN-20s. I mean, this is a devastating fighting force. And as these forces, the armored infantry and their armor, including not just their tank companies, but the armored vehicles they came in with, the tank company forces would essentially be mutually supporting elements, as the armored infantry was there to complement their armor, and likewise was the armor there to complement their armored infantry and their anti-tank forces, which were also devastating against infantry due to the types of weaponry that they carried, including their 6 grenade launchers that fired 25 millimeter grenades in a rapid manner. As these forces here had found out the hard way, they were essentially fired at by the grenades of these QN-506s, which devastated them in their position as the grenades slammed into the rubble and behind it, based on how the weapons were arced. And this force here, this group here was hit by a mortar at the opening, 120 millimeter mortar. All of it is ISR directed by the quadcopter reconnaissance assets possessed by each and every squad and vehicle, as China and Russia both had a full drone doctrine where they had built literally drones at the squad level into their fighting capabilities at the squad level. They had the capability to map the battlefield in real time and guide their weapons into their targets, as anything that could be seen on the modern fluid battlefield could be destroyed. And the combat in Eastern Europe, in the Great Eastern European Proxy War, had taught everybody this lesson, as the Russians had ravaged their opponents with well-directed artillery fires, FPV drones, Lancet 3s and other types of loitering munition strikes, and tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes on enemy targets, not to mention also the rocket artillery, and in addition to the howitzer artillery, was devastating. systems like the Tornado S. Not quite as long range as the Chinese A300, which is the longest range system in the world, but the Tornado definitely had an incredible range to it and was essentially right behind the Chinese system, which also was a 300 millimeter system with a 187 mile with the being the A300. Even the older PHL-03 that the Chinese possessed, typically in their reserve artillery forces, had an 80-mile range, which was still relatively far. As the forces equipped with those weapons that were in the Fort Hood battle could turn them to assist either the Waco or Austin battle, were covered by the range of such systems as they sat in Nolanville. In this battle, the A300s fired their shorter range ammunition to rocket the city into oblivion and would be assisting other elements in further battles with their longer range ammunition as these tanks were now moving up and maneuvering themselves into position as they too were taking fire and got into a duel with the American tanks, with this tank being destroyed at the opening by these forces firing their QN502Cs from the QN506. These QN502C missile, anti-tank / anti-air missiles, slammed into this tank and annihilated it, as well as 125 millimeter Sabo ammunition, which was a tungsten rod, essentially, that could puncture the Abrams armor with ease. They also had DU ammunition as well, which they would use sparingly if needed. But they would fire these devastating rounds at the tanks, and they could save their heat ammunition for lighter armored vehicles like Bradleys or armor personnel carriers, as the 125 millimeter heat rounds were enough to destroy the American IFVs. And not typically the Abrams, as it had incredibly good armor, just like the Chinese tanks. They could still be destroyed by the DU or the tungsten rounds, which were utilized, as well as also the ATGMs that could be fired again from the 125 millimeter main gun on the Type 96B, the Type 99A, the Type 88C, which was China's third best tank and still relatively formidable, as well as other older tanks that were highly upgraded in China's arsenal that could also fire ATGMs from their guns. These forces moved up here. This tank moved up here before maneuvering in different ways to essentially get into the best firing positions that they could, as this tank rolled over the rubble here and was being engaged by these forces moving over here. It used its heavy machine gun turret, its W85 12.7 millimeter machine gun, and its coax to basically sweep up these American reactionary civilians who had emerged from the sewer system thinking that they were in a safer area, only to find that the area was under heavy assault by PLA armored forces, and they were cut down by a hail of weaponry coming from this tank, as well as other vehicles as well, and the armored infantry troops moving up into the area who were firing weapons like their 35 millimeter tube-fired grenades from beneath their rifle barrels of the men that possessed those, their Type 69 anti-personnel ammunition from the rocket-propelled grenades, which all this fire coming in caused these armed reactionary civilians to move in two prongs, essentially right here, and they were all mowed down by this tank firing a Frag T shell into their rubble position right here, as well as heavy machine gun fire coming in. There were multiple systems being used at the same time. That needs to be understood. At the same targets often. And these guys were annihilated again at the very beginning by the grenade fire from the vehicles from these QN506s, as well as the 30 millimeter autocannon fire to cover the advance of their tanks. And all the firepower was again directed by ISR and heavily coordinated. As these forces came out of the sewer, they were hit by one of the short-range loitering munitions fired from the QN506, the S507, which landed and blasted these armed reactionary civilians to pieces, while these others had made it behind this rubble former home and were moving up as well, and would end up being cut down by Frag T shells as they could be directed in by the ISR assets. Same with these groupings here, who tried to retreat, while their tank here had people spreading messages and trying to coordinate a plan together, but essentially they would be cut down as it was very dangerous out in the open, even running between vehicles, trying to coordinate actions between these vehicles who were also being hit by different ammunition, whether it was certain types of tank shells fired in their direction, which slammed into rubble as well, or went between the rubble, or went over the rubble, depending on the arc of fire coming from the weapons that were being used against them. And even the infantry fighting vehicles with their anti-tank systems, their anti-tank missiles, their HJ-12Es, could fire those at quite a range, far beyond the scope of this battlefield right here. So this was a relatively short range to fire their anti-tank missile systems as it related to either the man-portable HJ-08s, as it related to the fired from the IFV HJ-12Es, or the anti-tank guided missiles, or ATGMs, that could be fired from the tanks themselves, from their own 125mm main guns. As they moved up and began maneuvering together, these tanks, their troops would hold their fire if the tanks were maneuvering in front of them, of course, as they coordinated everything through their combat data links, radio, and their ISR network. As they moved up, gradually, they began to overrun previously held American positions as these grenades were fired into this area from these QN-506 vehicles, 30mm autocannon fire, heavy machine gun fire from the turrets of the tank, coax machine gun fire from the tanks aside the barrel, as well as the tanks moving up and even firing frag T shells, which are fragmentation shells, which produced a lot of shrapnel in the blast, and we're hitting these areas right here, wiping out these armed reactionary civilians. It needs to be understood that even as this armor was moving up and mortar support was coming in at the same time, which wiped these guys out at the opening of the map who were fleeing from the sewer, along with these guys taking position on this city block right here, it needs to be understood that at the exact same time as that was occurring, the mechanized infantry forces on the other side of the battlefield were conducting their own operations, clearing buildings. Again, wedge formation, rolling T moving in to the building, rolling T moving into the building, wedge, one going outside as per SOP, along with the vehicle here from this platoon. The tanks moving up here from this tank platoon of the same company that was operating in this area, as there were 4 combat platoons of the company with their headquarters platoon actually in the William P. Hobby Airport, and it would have to provide armored recovery as they would end up losing a tank. Yes, they would lose a tank. Their tank would end up being directly fired into by an American tank within close range, and because the laser and IR scrambling of the Type 96B prevented long-range fires, this tank would end up bore sighting its shell that it hurriedly fired at one of these tanks and essentially ripped right through it with a DU round and destroyed it, because depleted uranium would have been really the only real round the Americans had that could really defeat the Chinese Type 96B, as it had incredible armor, and the depleted uranium was really the only type of round that would go right through it, especially at close range. As American heat rounds and other standard ammunition types were simply not enough to penetrate all of the layers of explosive reactive armor or applique NERA armor and the very strong tungsten steel alloy armor that was beneath it. So in return, they too would be destroyed as the Chinese tanks would maneuver in and fire upon them, along with other fires coming from the vehicles a bit further away as they moved up and began to essentially roll up all the resistance in the area. As they did this gradually, as some would move a bit further and faster than others, while others would take a more precaution, as they knew that they were in a battle of maneuver in a ravaged urban area with American armored forces. And it has to be understood, again, this is only one tank company of the armored battalion operating in just this area. These are elements of a second one, and then there were 2 other ones that were on the William P. Hobby Airport spread out, like what was done in Waco, to produce a very strong perimeter around the airport, as it was to become a mega fob, and they had headquarters elements as well as air defense elements inside as well, moving in from the support battalion of the air defense 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, in addition to also the Type 625E SHORAD air defense systems moving in. As the fighter jets were leaving the battlefield, with the bombers only lingering until they had expended their munitions, as they could linger a bit longer, and the fuel considerations, even mid-air refueling, had to return and redo their fuel and do any needed maintenance and get their aircraft airworthy again for the next mission. These aircraft essentially leaving would leave, at least for a short time, all of the air defense up to the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, and all the SHORAD systems operated at the Combined Arms Brigade level, which consisted of the SPAAA 95s, which were adequate in terms of their SHORAD capabilities and were self-propelled armored air defense artillery vehicles, in other words. They had good radar, and they had excellent radar tracking, which could actually automate the fires, as in where it aimed the weapons, and the crew could either do this manually or automatically based on the radar targeting, which was a common theme in a lot of different types of air defense systems, similar to the German Gepard in some ways as well. As these were relatively effective, they would, in addition to the much more advanced systems operated by the 83rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, including from SHORAD all the way up to long range, like their HQ-22s that were deployed in 2 different battalions, as well as the HQ-16, which was also a mid-range and very effective air defense platform, they would be plenty to cover the entire battle space from longer range all the way into the shorter range, which was miles in each direction, like typically about between 5 and 7 miles for some of the SHORAD systems in terms of the complete range radius around the systems, as well as longer range having upwards of 100 miles or more, and that related to the HQ-22. And these systems, including the HQ-16, had quite a range and altitude to them as well, and could cover, as in a different layering of the capabilities, the entire battlefield for the time that the aircraft would be gone. However, it wouldn't essentially matter at this point, because the USAF had essentially, for all intents and purposes, been destroyed completely on the ground, minus very few instances where some of the aircraft had been in the air doing their own standard training or combat air patrols at the time of the invasion kicking off. Those were rapidly shot down. China had some of the best and longest range air-to-air missiles in the world, like the PL-15, and newer ones coming out even longer range, giving them an incredible standoff capability. The Russians as well had some very well-ranged air-to-air missiles too, and these would ravage the USAF or the Marines or the Navy aircraft that had been airborne at the time of the invasion's kickoff. And this will continue in the next video, as the scope of this battle was relatively large in terms of not just the area it was fought in, but the maneuvering that was taking place throughout the entire combat area as the different forces tried to get themselves into the most advantageous fighting positions even possible in the ravaged neighborhood that became a graveyard of vehicles. And even the PLA would lose some vehicles and troops, but for the most part, it would be the Americans that suffered the most, lacking ISR capabilities, lacking the proper technologies that would even be effective in this type of warfare, and also lacking actionable intel to be able to piece together any kind of strike packages in any way, shape, or form, as well as also to be able to act on it and act on it effectively, and having the right weapons to even do so. With America having lost any sense of any type of air superiority, their capabilities were diminished even further. And the air defense alone possessed by the Chinese, and even the Russians added to that, was so incredibly advanced and numerous that really and truly they didn't even need to use air power. They could have had the entire USAF take off and knock them out of the skies, as the Chinese and Russian systems were numerous again and could track multiple systems at one time and fire and down many of them. However, the addition of their ginormous combat air fleets combined, the Chinese and Russians, as China had the most combat aircraft of any nation on Earth in terms of just sheer combat aircraft, from fighters, ground attack aircraft, and heavy strategic bombers all combined. They, based on their numbers of tactical fighter bombers and fighters alone, had the biggest Air Force in terms of combat aircraft alone on the face of the Earth. And when added to their large second biggest strategic bomber fleet in the world behind Russia's, as Russia kept many strategic bombers from the Cold War era in reserve and maintained them, China had actively more bombers, but when Russia mobilized these massive bomber forces, Russia ended up with more than even China. However, China still had more combat planes due to the sheer number of fighters and ground attack planes they possessed, tactical fighter bombers, also known as strike aircraft or ground attack planes. China had the most fighters and ground attack aircraft of any nation on Earth. And when combining their bombers, they had the most combat aircraft on Earth, with Russia being second. And combining both air forces for this massive, enormous undertaking, the biggest invasion ever seen in human history, required the vast majority of their weapons to overcome a nation of this size, in addition to the knocking down of communications, ISR, and everything America would have depended on, including GPS, for their forces, which many of their weapons were dependent upon. And now they had nothing reliable with which to fend off the fourth generation warfare doctrinal invasion of their nation, as forces materializing literally inside their borders made it impossible for them to mobilize, as their facilities were overrun or destroyed in a rapid manner, leaving them with no real defensive capabilities to overcome such an undertaking, as fourth generation warfare was far more destructive and quicker than even third generation warfare blitzkrieg style campaigning, as beginning inside your enemy's nation ensured that they could be rapidly removed as any type of threat and destroyed as a result. This battle will continue in the next installment, as the battle is only getting started and the forces are only now beginning to make contact with one another in this very destructive battle of the Houston core area that had been heavily and ravaged fires as well, leaving the city as a heap of ruins.